Charles II to most British people is remembered as the party-loving king, the fun guy who brought back fun and had fun hair and non-stop parties and lots of girlfriends, and wasn't he so much fun? What Charles II also loved, though, was revenge. Charles II's childhood was not as bright and colourful as his adult life. He grew up in the midst of a bloody civil war, a war of parliament against king. The king being his father, Charles I.
When his father lost the war and then his head, Charles had fled into exile on the continent, but he came back years later in 1651 for one last attempt at royalist victory. When he also lost, he had to flee again. This time, it took 6 weeks to evade capture and find safe passage back to France.
His youth on the continent was nothing compared to what he was promised as a young prince. Now the throne he was being raised to take no longer existed, his place in the world only being saved by his mother being a French princess. Though on the continent, they were still under threat, being perceived as a threat themselves to the new order back home in England. In 1660, though, he was called back to England with the offer to become king and restore the monarchy. He and his family would no longer be outcasts and exiles on the continent, but the elitist of the elite back home. He would finally claim his divinely elected crown. There were just some things he had to sort out first. After all, the only reason he had to return home was because certain people had decided to kill his dad. And he couldn't help but wonder what they were up to now. Before we dive into what he decided to do with them, let's first do a speed run of the decades leading up to this. King Charles I believed in absolute monarchy, which basically means he thought he should be the only one with any say. He saw his divine election by God as meaning he was the only one with the right to rule. His parliament continuously complained about certain policies and taxes he kept raising, asking for a more constitutional monarchy. This meant that Charles's power would be more controlled, and he would have more rules to follow, typically giving those powers they'd taken to parliament instead. Tensions rose and neither side budged until Charles ended up fleeing London after trying and failing to arrest 5 of his most vocal opponents. Months later, in August 1642, he raised his standard in Nottingham, declaring war on his disobedient parliament and his unruly people. Charles lost. Twice. He lost the First Civil War in 1646 and was captured. He managed to escape his imprisonment at Hampton Court Palace and fled to the Isle of Wight, thinking that one Colonel Hammond would protect him. He arrested him instead. Several uprisings in this period are considered the Second Civil War, which the Royalists also lost. Charles made several more attempts at escaping, raising various troops to regain control from Parliament. At this point, it's important to remember he was still king, just an incredibly difficult and untrustworthy one in the eyes of Parliament. Clearly, he was going to continue to be an issue and would not relinquish any of his power easily. Unfortunately for Charles, his chances of survival were shrinking by the day, as his stubbornness was coming against an increasingly extreme Parliament. In December 1648, Colonel Pride stationed his men outside of the Parliament session that was to decide what to do with their imprisoned king. Pride refused entry to any and all more moderate and forgiving MPs, leaving mostly the extreme military men to make the decision. They decided Charles should be put on trial for crimes against his people. They sent out invites to 135 men, asking them to be commissioners in their new High Court of Justice, which would be trying the king. Half of these men did not show up. During the trial, Charles was given many opportunities to defend himself, but ever the stubborn king, believing he was the only one who should have any power as God decided, his only argument was, "You're not a real court. You can't do this to me." They were getting nowhere, and Charles had unfortunately proven himself to be a never-ending threat to the new order these extreme militarized men were trying to form. They couldn't imprison him for life. He kept escaping. They couldn't exile him without the constant fear he'd raise support with foreign powers. They also apparently couldn't reason with him into getting him to accept some responsibility and then a constitutional monarchy. The final decision was that he had to die. 59 men signed the king's death warrant. He was executed on the 31st of January, 1649. What followed was several confusing years of what on earth to do next. The leftover MPs may have all agreed that the king had to die, but they didn't agree on literally anything else. Following a third civil war, this time against the late king's son, the then Prince Charles, yes, hello again, who raised an army in Scotland in an attempt to ignite a royalist rebellion and retake control, the Protectorate was born in 1653. This was under the military's rising star, Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Protector. Present at the trial and an increasingly loud voice in political and religious matters, he was their chosen figurehead. There were several attempts to solidify this Protectorate regime, but to no avail. Subsequently, Cromwell was offered the title of king instead several times, but denied it several times, though it can be argued he was king in all but name, having had a ceremony that was basically a coronation and deciding his successor as protector would be his eldest son. So when Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard took over, but was a massive flop. He was deposed by a military coup only 8 months later. After a little more floundering, they decided that bringing back the monarchy was the most stable option. The best way to do that was to bring home the exiled eldest son of the king they killed to become Charles II. Great, the monarchy's back. Welcome home, Charles. It wasn't all sunshine and smiles though. After decades of confusion, war, and instability, when Charles II came back to England in 1660 to rule, we don't often consider just how scary that might have been for the people of the country that had exiled him and his family and executed his father. Half the country had fought against his dad, or even the new king himself in that third civil war we mentioned. Everyone had lived and worked under or for the Protectorate regime, and he wasn't exactly back because everyone really loved him and believed in the monarchy. He was simply the best and most stable option after the collapse of the Protectorate. Everyone expected revenge, vengeance, something. What they got instead was the Act of Oblivion, which outlined the events we are talking about today. The act basically said, surprisingly, that all was forgiven. Past Civil War parliamentarians, Protectorate government officials, it didn't matter. The slate was wiped clean, hoping for a fresh start with their fresh new king. Except, obviously, he couldn't be entirely forgiving of everyone, and I did open the video by saying that Charles II wanted revenge. Not only could he not restart the monarchy being perceived as a weak king, but this was also extremely personal. I mean, they killed his dad, and wouldn't you want some kind of retribution for a youth like that? There had to be some exceptions, and those exceptions were the 59 men who signed his father's death warrant. They were to be found and brought to trial for their treason. Now, it had been over a decade since Charles I's trial, so some of these men were in fact dead, including, as we said, Oliver Cromwell. But being dead was no excuse. The new Charles could still make an example out of them, but we'll come back to them later. Following the Act of Oblivion, those who fit the bill were being arrested, told they were to face trial, sometimes with a turnaround of a matter of hours. Some had the forethought to run away to the continent, but that also didn't guarantee their safety. Those who fled were quietly disappearing or suddenly being found dead. We're going to focus on just a few of the regicides today, but we may cover others in later content. Today, we will be covering Henry Marten, a Republican MP who was one of the lead judges at the King's trial, Thomas Harrison, an officer and lawyer, also a judge at the trial, John Cook, lead prosecutor of the trial, and Francis Hacker, the guy who delivered the king and the death warrant to the scaffold. Yep, I'm deadly serious about that one. Hacker was the literal messenger. Without further ado, let's dive in. The case against Henry Marten. Henry, or Harry Marten, was a Civil War parliamentarian, but he didn't do any fighting. He was an MP before, during, and after the wars, preferring to focus on political change rather than bloody battle. Marten was known as somewhat of a radical. He was never shy to express his more extreme views, leading one time to his imprisonment in the Tower of London in 1643, only a year into the First Civil War. This was for arguing that all problems would be solved if the royal family were just removed and the monarchy was abolished, a view very few people shared even after the civil wars. His political views matched him up with the likes of John Lilburne and the Levellers. These were a group who, to oversimplify, as their name suggests, believed that God wanted all classes to be level among men, so government should be created by popular vote and consent. It doesn't sound too outrageous to us today, but back in the era of absolute monarchy, it was insanity to many. Ever the vocal Republican, he agreed to be one of the commissioners at the King's trial and one of the signatories of the King's death warrant. The ideal of of the Protectorate, a state without monarchy, was Henry Marten's dream, and he was active in Parliament for as long as he was able to, but he did spend most of the regime imprisoned for debt. He was recalled into the Parliament of 1659, which resulted in the return of the king. At the announcement of the Act of Oblivion, he actually handed himself over. Now for the trial. At the trial, he was said to have acted courageously, though at first, he had an odd strategy to ensure his survival. His argument boiled down to, wait a minute, the document says Henry Marten, but I'm Harry Marten. The court was confused, to say the least. He'd given himself up. He said he was a regicide, and everyone knew what his name was, and you could see it on the warrant. Henry or Harry, he was well known by this point, a scandalous man who was known to have mistresses and even was verbal in his doubts that God existed, a man who spoke out against monarchy and advocated for alternative styles of government only a year into the First Civil War. So what on earth was he playing at? The only possible saving grace at this point was that he was also known, contrary to all other aspects of his principles and beliefs, to have protected royalists during the 1650s. This good deed and his strange charm was all he had to rely on following such a strange defense. The case against Thomas Harrison. Thomas Harrison was a lawyer turned parliamentarian soldier during the Civil Wars. Through the military, he slowly rose in the ranks to Major General by the end of the First Civil War. He was a known friend and supporter of another fast riser, Oliver Cromwell. Harrison was elected to Parliament in 1646. He was wounded in the Second Civil War, but managed to pull himself together to command King Charles I's escort to his trial. During the trial, he was one of the many commissioners present and one of the signatories of the death warrant. Following the king's death, he continued his military career, taking an infamous command in Wales, where he was known to be incredibly severe. His severity earned him a promotion, being a frontrunner in Cromwell's Scottish campaigns. In the early 1650s, he became involved with a religious group known as the Fifth Monarchists, a type of Puritan who believed in the prophecies in the Book of Daniel. Basically, he believed there would be 4 doomed kingdoms, followed by the final 5th godly one. Many Fifth Monarchists, like Harrison, believed the falling of the 4th kingdom was marked by the death of Charles I, so anything other than a purely godly kingdom next was pure sin. As such, he became a problem when Cromwell became Lord Protector, refusing to leave the proceedings once they had concluded and ultimately being thrown out. He was then kicked out the army and arrested 4 times during the regime. Following Cromwell's death, he refused to back anyone's bids for power, and after the Restoration, he continued to basically just stay home and sulk. But when the Act of Oblivion was announced, he refused to run away, leading to his arrest and trial. Thomas Harrison refused to play tricks, and he refused to apologize. At his trial, he completely owned his actions and that the signature was his own. He was unashamed. He wanted everyone to know that he had a part in the king's death, the falling of that 4th kingdom. He acted on the authority of the Parliament at the time, as well as by his conscience and the presumed word of God. His defense was continuously interrupted by the judges as he refused to apologize and kept calling them an inferior court. The interruptions finally got to him, and he said since they would not hear him, he had nothing more to say. It was chaotic and disastrous. The ruling was instant. What that was, we'll get back to that. The case against John Cook. John Cook is considered one of the finest legal minds of his day. A radical compared to his contemporaries for sure, he believed in the power of the law above all else. He established the precedents for several radical legal reforms, including the right to silence, the cab rank rule, meaning solicitors had an obligation to accept any case within their expertise, abolishing imprisonment for debt, and he would give legal representation for free if the client could not afford it. When Charles I was put on trial, the job of chief prosecutor was surely not a very attractive one, but based on his beliefs, Cook felt obligated and accepted. There was no legal precedent for trying a still reigning monarch, so it was difficult to know exactly what to do, which was what Charles I was trying to capitalize on in his constant assertion that they had no right to try him. During Charles I's trial, Cook was the counterpart of one of its most famous moments. Whilst reading the indictment, the king had tried to interrupt Cook multiple times, but Cook continued to read. Getting frustrated, the king repeatedly tapped him on the shoulder with his cane. The strength he hit him with increased and increased until he hit him so hard the ornamental top of his cane snapped off and rolled onto the floor. The king gestured for Cook to pick it up, but Cook simply stared at him. Charles I got up, leaned down, and got it himself. Many saw it as a symbol of the once supreme monarchy bowing down in the face of the law. Cook had publicly embarrassed the late king, as well as leading the prosecution against him. He was arrested as a regicide. The court accused him of 3 things: that he had contrived and imagined the king's death, that he had taken it upon himself to accuse and murder the king, and that he had helped in the procurement of the anonymous executioner. Cook obviously had an answer for each. Firstly, that the proclamation for the trial and the formation of the High Court was dated before he was nominated as or accepted the role of prosecutor, so he had no hand in creating or imagining the trial. Secondly, that he did what he did by a legal act of Parliament, though the court refused the act's legality now. Thirdly, that he had not played any part, judge, jury, executioner, accuser, or witness, that could possibly make him seen as responsible or guilty of treason. He continued down the line that he had an obligation to the law, that his job and expertise made it impossible for him to refuse the case, that he had no intent of his own, only the carrying out of justice. He was merely the counsel and nothing more. The case against Francis Hacker. Colonel Francis Hacker was a very vocal parliamentarian during the Civil Wars who showed himself to be a loyal asset to the cause. As such, he was given the responsibility of heading the King's Guard during the trial. He escorted the King to and from Westminster Hall, where he was being tried. When the death warrant was signed, Hacker was not on the letter, but the envelope, if you will. Him and 2 others had the document and delivered it to the scaffold. He was with the King at the scaffold, allegedly treated him with respect, before signing the order to the executioner. After the execution, he was a strong and vocal supporter of the Protectorate. He continued his military career under Cromwell, though they butted heads a few times over religion, with Hacker complaining that Cromwell's officers were more concerned with preaching to the troops than leading them into battle. He was a sitting MP during Cromwell's son Richard's catastrophic attempt to rule, though Hacker was known to just kind of watch everything happening instead of actually doing anything. At the time of the Restoration, he was still in military command, so he was quickly imprisoned in the Tower of London. Initially, he was not considered one of the regicides, but whilst the House of Lords was debating how to treat the regicides, it came to light that he still had the King's death warrant at his house. His wife was asked to please bring his copy of the death warrant so that the court could use it as evidence against the horrible regicides, not her husband who was currently in prison for something else. She unknowingly provided them with the evidence that added his name to the list of the condemned. During the trial, he didn't argue too much. He said they had all the information that he had, that he was acting under his office by the orders they could all see in the death warrant. What else could he do? This is a tough one. Hacker had no hand in the decision. He had no power in the decision or his role. But does that make him not responsible for what he did? If we look at it through Charles II's eyes, can we really argue that he was just doing his job when so many others were refusing to do the role? Okay, so now we know the details of the cases of our 4 chosen regicides. So what happened to each of them? Harry Marten, was found guilty, unsurprisingly. What was surprising, though, was his sentence. He signed the death warrant, no contest. However, for his protection of royalists during the 1650s, his sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, down from execution. This life imprisonment was not as you might imagine for a man convicted of killing a king. At first, he was imprisoned at Windsor Castle, but Charles II moved him to Chepstow in Wales as he thought he was just too close by. Marten's wife remained free at their house, but his mistress, Mary Ward, was situated nearby him to attend to him. And at Chepstow, he didn't have a cell. He had a suite. So yes, he was inside all the time, but he was looked after and had his girlfriend next door to visit him whenever he wanted. No one else in our list got out of it quite so nicely. Thomas Harrison and John Cook were also found guilty and faced the same sentence as each other: execution. Not just any execution, though. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Though this phrase is thrown around a lot, let's take a minute to really understand what that meant. On screen is the description from Harrison's sentence, but I will quickly describe it. They were hanged until only unconscious. Their private parts were cut off, before being disemboweled and forced to watch as they threw them into a fire. They were then beheaded and quartered. Their body parts then belonged to the king to do with what he wanted. It is said, though, that Harrison's execution happened a little out of order. After losing consciousness on the scaffold, then being laid out for the next procedure, it's said that he sat up and punched the executioner in the face. Clearly not one to give in easily, they had to behead him first. Francis Hacker was also found guilty, but his sentence ended with hanging. Then his body was released to his family and friends. These men were not alone. Remember we said we'd come back to those regicides who were already dead? Well, it's their time to shine. Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, and Henry Ireton were the unfortunate 3 dead who Charles II simply could not let lie. Cromwell, obviously as the face of the Protectorate and a key signatory of the warrant, John Bradshaw, being the president of the High Court of Justice at the King's trial leading the proceedings, and Henry Ireton, who was Cromwell's son-in-law and a key signatory. The decision was made that their bodies would suffer the punishment they would have faced in life. Their bodies were dug up, taken to Tyburn, where they were hanged, their bodies being left from sunup to sunset, to ensure as many people saw as possible. When they were cut down, they were beheaded, and their heads displayed atop Westminster Hall, where King Charles I's trial had been. They remained there until a storm blew them down. Cromwell's head was then found and went on a long series of adventures we've discussed in previous videos. As I said, these were just some of the stories of the men who killed Charles I, but when looking at them together, it does present an interesting question. John Cook and Thomas Harrison received the full, terrifying extent of the new king's revenge, a brutal and bloody death. However, Harrison had done no worse an act than Marten, who got a pretty sweet deal out of it. Not even an allegedly quicker and dignified execution like Hacker, but a full life, though indoors, and privileges with his mistress. Being kind to a few royalists surely couldn't constitute such a drastic change, but Harrison was more unpopular, less missed. Cook was more insignificant still, and his radical legal reforms made him a threat. Prioritizing law over loyalty was not really the done thing, especially in the eyes of a king, whose power rested on the idea of being chosen by God, though in reality, Charles II was actually chosen by some very stressed and tired parliamentarians. Cook could argue the legality of Charles I's trial, and King Charles II could not try the regicides, with that being the case. Cook also had to be painted as a traitor, or no revenge, or justice, depending on how you look at it, could be had. They were all technically accused of the same crime, but the results across the board varied drastically. We will end with a little food for thought with the words of John Cook. While awaiting his execution, he wrote a letter to his wife. In it, he wrote his final reasoning for his involvement, his lack of regret for his involvement, and his feelings towards the state of the world he was about to leave. He wrote, "We fought for the public good and would have enfranchised the people and secured the welfare of the whole groaning creation, if the nation had not more delighted in servitude than in freedom."